The clash reached its loudest long before Europe's kingdoms were carved. When churchmen met at Nicaea, Laodicea, and Carthage, they argued and voted the Western canon into shape. But high in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia quietly refused.
Then they came with flags, guns, and a hunger for power, storms marching across the Horn of Africa with a single quiet target: Ethiopia's soul, not its gold, not its land, its book. For centuries, wave after wave of foreign powers pressed against the highlands,
trying to break a nation that refused to kneel. And at the center of this long, fierce resistance stood something older than their empires, older than their churches, older than most of their written history, the Ethiopian Bible. This wasn't just a book to them, it was a threat, a reminder that Africa had written its own scripture.
Preserved its own spiritual memory long before the West decided what Christian history should look like. And as Europe expanded its reach across the world, the existence of a Bible older, broader, and untouched by Western hands was something they simply couldn't swallow. So the pressure mounted, armies invaded.
Ethiopia was already writing, preserving, and guarding one of the oldest and most complete biblical traditions on earth.
Before we dive back into this powerful chapter of our history, take a second to show us some love. Hit that like button, share this video with your people so the conversation keeps moving, and don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you stay in the loop every time we drop new knowledge.
There, the clash reached one of its loudest moments in Vatican circles around the 4th and 5th centuries, long before Europe ever imagined the kingdoms it would later build. When church leaders met at the Council of Nicaea in 325,
then Laodicea, then Carthage, they argued, cut, removed, trimmed, and voted their way into what would become the Western canon. But far from Rome's reach, in the mountains of the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia quietly refused to participate. And
then they came with flags, with guns, with a hunger for power. Storms marching across the Horn of Africa with a single quiet target. Not its gold, not its land, but its book.
For centuries, wave after wave of foreign powers pressed against these ancient highlands, trying to break a nation that refused to kneel. And at the center of this resistance stood something older than their empires, older than their churches, older than most of their written...
The Ethiopian Bible. This was not just a book, it was a threat.
There is a quiet shock when people first encounter the Ethiopian Bible. It does not announce itself. It does not shout controversy. It simply exists, ancient, complete, unchanged.
And in that quiet existence lies a truth that unsettles Western religious history. Christianity did not wait for Europe to define it. And the Bible did not begin in the hands of the West. Ethiopia stands as living proof.
The history of the Ethiopian Bible cannot be separated from the history of Ethiopia itself. Located in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian nations on earth. Once home to the mighty Aksumite Empire, a civilization of trade, architecture, and faith. Among the first kingdoms to adopt Christianity as a state religion.
This decision would shape Ethiopia forever.
Tradition holds that Ethiopia was evangelized in the 1st century by the apostles themselves. The Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in the book of Acts returned home carrying the faith. Over time, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church developed its own theology, its own worship,
its own scripture, independent, rooted, unsubmitted, a faith whose roots reach deeper than Rome.
For nearly 2,000 years, Ethiopia preserved a biblical tradition outside Roman authority. Monks traveled deserts and mountains with parchment and ink. They wrote by candlelight. They hid manuscripts in caves. They preserved every book handed down to them.
While Western councils debated canon by vote, Ethiopia preserved it by inheritance. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah. The West trimmed its Bible. Ethiopia did not. Their canon would stand at 81 books.
In the 16th century, Europe returned with confidence and ambition. Jesuit missionaries arrived, calling their mission reform, but it was replacement. Ethiopian traditions were condemned. Their canon was called corrupt.
What followed was chaos. Not a rejection of Christianity, but a rejection of foreign control over scripture. The people resisted. The empire fractured. In 1632, Ethiopia chose its soul. The Jesuits were expelled. The ancient Bible restored.
The word returned to the mountains. Christianity was never owned by the West, and Ethiopia was never a footnote. It was, and remains, a witness.